The evening air in Lisbon carried the soft hum of the city below, distant laughter from a riverside cafe, the occasional clink of wine glasses, the low murmur of conversations in half a dozen languages. Up on the rooftop terrace of a sleek glass building in the heart of the financial district, the atmosphere was different. Polished, curated, almost too perfect. Men in tailored suits and women in designer gowns moved through the space like pieces on a chessboard, each step calculated, each smile measured. It was one of those exclusive tech networking events where fortunes were whispered about more than made, and connections mattered more than credentials. Near the railing, slightly apart from the main crowd, stood a young woman in a deep indigo dress. It wasn't bought off a runway, it was stitched by her own hands. The fabric dyed using a traditional method her grandmother had taught her back in Dakar. She held a small glass of sparkling water, not because she didn't drink, but because she preferred to stay clear-headed in rooms like this. Her name wasn't announced over a loudspeaker, and no one had introduced her with fanfare. She was there by accident, really. Her colleague had come down with a sudden fever that morning, and since she happened to be in Lisbon for a language documentation project with a local nonprofit, she'd agreed to step in at the last minute. She didn't expect to be noticed. She didn't want to be, but someone did notice. He walked over with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing you've never been told no. Tall, silver-haired at the temples, wearing a watch that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He had that look, polished, practiced, the kind of man who could close $1 million deal while ordering coffee. He glanced at her dress, then at her face, and something in his expression shifted just slightly, like he was trying to place her in a category that didn't quite exist. "What's someone like you doing at an event like this?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the kind of casual assumption that people like him often mistake for charm. She didn't flinch. She'd heard variations of that question her whole life, in school hallways, airport security lines, job interviews where her resume was impressive, but her skin tone seemed to raise invisible eyebrows. She met his gaze evenly, no anger, no defensiveness, just calm. "I speak 9 languages," she said simply. For a second, he just stared. Then he laughed, a short, amused sound like she'd told a cute joke. He nodded slowly as if humoring a child who just claimed they could fly. "Sure," he said, already turning away, waving a hand like he was brushing off a stray thought. "Nice to meet you." But he didn't walk far. Something about the way she'd said it, no bragging, no flourish, stuck with him. Most people at these events dropped names, companies, valuations. She'd dropped a fact, plain and quiet, like it was just part of who she was, not a performance. He paused near the bar, glanced back. She was still there, looking out over the city lights, completely at ease in her solitude. That bothered him more than he expected. He was used to being the center of attention, the one people leaned in to hear. But this woman, she didn't seem to care if anyone heard her at all. Curiosity got the better of him. He circled back. 9 languages, huh? He said, this time with a little less smirk, a little more genuine interest. "Which ones?" She turned to face him fully now. "Portuguese," she said, switching effortlessly into fluent European Portuguese. "Since I've been living here part-time for the past 2 years. Wolof, that's from Senegal, where I was born. French, because school in Dakar was in French. Dutch, because we moved to Brussels when I was 10, and the neighborhood spoke Flemish. Then there's Arabic. My father's side is from Guinea, and classical Arabic was part of our home prayers. Mandarin, because I spent a summer teaching in Yunnan province and fell in love with the tones. Finnish. I had a roommate in Helsinki who wouldn't speak English unless absolutely necessary. Russian, from working with Ukrainian refugees in Warsaw. And English, of course, though I learned it late, mostly from old American movies my uncle used to play on repeat." She said it all without pausing for breath, without checking for approval. It wasn't a list meant to impress. It was just her life. The man, Julian, though she didn't know his name yet, blinked. He'd expected maybe Spanish, French, a bit of Italian. Not Wolof, not Finnish, not a story that spanned continents and crises and quiet acts of survival. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in years, he didn't have a slick reply ready. "You're serious," he finally said, voice lower now. "I don't joke about language," she replied. "It's how people survive. How they're seen. How they stay human when everything else is taken away." There was a weight in her words that silenced the usual noise in his head. The deals, the metrics, the endless chase for the next big thing. Around them, the party continued. Champagne corks popped. Investors toasted their own brilliance. Someone was pitching an app that disrupted grief. But here, in this small pocket of the terrace, something real had just happened. Julian shifted, uncomfortable but intrigued. "All right," he said, half challenging, half genuinely curious. "Prove it." She raised an eyebrow. "You want me to perform?" "No," he said quickly, then hesitated. "I mean, just show me. Pick 5. Right now." A small crowd had begun to gather, people drawn by the unusual tension, the rare sight of Julian Voss looking unsure. She looked around, not nervous, just thoughtful. Then she nodded. "Fine," she said, "but not for you. For them." She gestured to a group of waitstaff nearby, men and women who'd been invisible to most guests all night, carrying trays, clearing glasses, speaking in hushed tones. One was from Cape Verde, another from Morocco, a third from Romania. She walked over to the Cape Verdean server and greeted him warmly in Cape Verdean Creole. His eyes lit up. He hadn't heard his dialect spoken by a guest in years. She asked how his daughter was doing in school. He laughed, surprised and touched. Then she turned to the Moroccan woman and switched to Daria, asking about her mother's health. The woman's hand flew to her chest. "You speak like my sister," she whispered. Back with Julian, she didn't gloat. She just stood there, quiet again, as if she'd simply done what anyone would do. Julian stared at her, then at the staff, who were now smiling, standing a little taller. He felt something shift inside him, like a door he didn't know was closed had just creaked open. "You weren't showing off," he said slowly. "No," she said. "I was reminding them they matter." And in that moment, the millionaire realized he'd been the one on display all along, not her. The rooftop air had cooled slightly and the crowd around them had thinned. Some guests drifted back to the bar, others returned to their circles of influence, but a few lingered, curious. Julian stood still, hands in his pockets, watching the young woman as she chatted easily with the servers, switching languages like changing lanes in traffic. Smooth, natural, never forced. There was no performance in it, no rehearsed flourish. It was just how she moved through the world. He cleared his throat. "Okay," he said, stepping closer. "You've got my attention." She turned, not with triumph, but with quiet readiness. "Good," she replied, "because attention is the first step to understanding." He almost laughed, not the dismissive chuckle from before, but something softer, more genuine. "All right then. Let's say I believe you. What now?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You don't really believe me yet. You're intrigued, yes, but you still think it's a trick." Something memorized. A party skill. He didn't deny it. "Fair," he admitted. "So, prove it in a way even I can't explain away." A small smile touched her lips. "You want to test?" "If you're willing." She glanced around. The event was winding down. Waiters were stacking chairs. A soft jazz trio packed up their instruments. This wasn't the place for a spectacle, and she wasn't the type to turn her life into one. But she also knew that sometimes, to be seen, you had to let people witness what they refused to imagine. "Fine," she said, "but not here. And not for show. Let's make it useful." She led him downstairs, not to the grand lobby, but to a quiet side room where event staff took breaks. A few housekeepers and kitchen aides were sipping tea, speaking in low voices. She greeted each in their native tongue, Romanian, Amharic, Bengali, and asked if they'd mind helping with a little exercise. They agreed, amused and flattered. Julian followed, suddenly feeling like an outsider in a world he'd always assumed he owned. She turned to him. "Pick 5 languages, any 5. I'll hold a real conversation, about something meaningful, with someone who speaks it natively. No scripts. No prompts," he hesitated. "What if I pick one you don't actually know?" "Then I'll tell you I don't know it," she said simply. "But I won't pretend." He nodded, impressed by her honesty more than her claim. "All right. Portuguese." She turned to a young woman from Porto who handled floral arrangements. In fluent, warm Portuguese, she asked about the challenges of sourcing native flowers in a city increasingly dominated by imported varieties. The woman lit up, talking about her grandmother's garden, the scent of orange blossoms in spring, how developers kept paving over old orchards. Julian listened, stunned, not just by the fluency but by the depth. This wasn't tourist Portuguese. This was the language of memory, of loss, of love. Next, he said, voice quieter now. Mandarin. An older kitchen porter, originally from Guangdong, stepped forward. She switched instantly, not to textbook Mandarin, but to a gentle, respectful tone with just enough regional awareness to put him at ease. She asked about his hometown, his grandchildren, whether he missed the taste of home-cooked congee. He laughed, eyes glistening, and said, "You speak like my daughter before she moved to Canada and forgot." Julian's chest tightened. He'd expected vocabulary. He hadn't expected heart. "Finnish," he said next, almost testing her. A quiet dishwasher from Helsinki, who rarely spoke to guests, looked up in surprise when she addressed him in smooth, lilting Finnish. She asked about the long winters, how he stayed connected to home. He spoke about saunas, about silence being a language of its own, about missing the sound of snow under boots. She nodded, understanding not just the words, but the weight behind them. By now, Julian wasn't just listening, he was watching her face. The way her eyes softened when someone mentioned family, the way she leaned in slightly, giving her full presence. This wasn't recitation. This was connection. "One more," he said, voice rough. "Arabic." She turned to a security guard from Sudan, but instead of modern standard Arabic, the formal version taught in schools, she spoke in Sudanese Arabic, warm and rhythmic, asking about his village near the Nile, whether the rains had come this year. He answered with relief, as if finally being spoken to in a way that felt like home. "You even use the old proverbs," he said, shaking his head in wonder. Julian stood silent for a long moment. The room was quiet now, everyone watching him. He ran a hand through his hair, uncharacteristically flustered. "Okay," he finally said. "I get it. You're fluent, but anyone can learn phrases. Anyone can mimic tone. How do I know you actually lived these languages? That you didn't just collect them like souvenirs?" She didn't take offense. Instead, she looked at him with something like pity, not cruel but sad. "Language isn't a trophy," she said gently. "It's a bridge. And you don't build a bridge by memorizing blueprints. You build it by walking across it again and again, even when it's hard." She paused, then added, "If you really want to know if I understand, don't test my words. Test my silence." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, "that real understanding shows up when you stop talking. When you listen not just to reply, but to hold space for someone else's truth." Just then, the Sudanese guard spoke up. "Last year, during Ramadan, she came to our community center. She didn't just translate documents. She sat with elders who'd lost their children in the war. She didn't offer solutions. She just stayed. In their language, in their grief." Julian looked down. For the first time, he felt small. Not because he lacked money or power, but because he'd mistaken knowledge for wisdom. He took a breath. "All right," he said. "You win." "I didn't come here to win," she replied. "I came because someone needed me to be here. That's always been the point." He nodded slowly. The arrogance that had carried him through boardrooms and billion-dollar deals had finally met something it couldn't buy. Couldn't outmaneuver. Couldn't reduce to a metric. Human dignity, carried in the cadence of 9 different tongues. He looked at her, not as a curiosity, not as a challenge, but as a person. "What's your name?" he asked properly this time. She smiled. "Amina." "Amina," he repeated, testing the sound. It felt different on his tongue now, less foreign, more familiar. "I'd like to hear more, not as a test, just as a human being." She studied him for a long moment. Then with a small nod, she said, "Only if you promise to listen, not to respond, not to fix, just to hear." "I'll try," he said, and for once he meant it. Later that night, long after the rooftop lights had dimmed and the last guests had disappeared into Lisbon's winding streets, they found themselves in a small cafe tucked away near Alfama. It wasn't fancy, just a few wooden tables, a chalkboard menu in Portuguese, and the rich smell of coffee beans roasting in the back. The owner, an older woman with silver braids and a knowing smile, brought them 2 cups without asking. She'd seen Amina around before, always speaking softly to the North African shopkeepers or helping lost tourists with directions in whatever language they needed. She nodded at Julian like she already knew he had some catching up to do. They sat in silence for a while, steam curling from their cups, the city humming outside like a lullaby. Julian stirred his coffee slowly, unsure where to begin. He'd spent his life pitching ideas, closing deals, convincing people of his vision. But this time he didn't want to talk. He wanted to understand. Finally, he looked up. How did you end up like this? Speaking all those languages, I mean. It's not exactly common. Amina smiled. Not with pride, but with the kind of quiet acceptance that comes from a life shaped by necessity, not choice. It wasn't a plan, she said. It was survival. She leaned back, her eyes drifting to the cobblestone street outside. I was born in Dakar. My mother spoke Wolof at home, the language of her childhood, of market songs and bedtime stories. My father, from Guinea, spoke Pooler and prayed in Arabic. So from the start, I learned that words weren't just sounds, they were doors. Open one and you entered someone's world. When she was 10, her family moved to Brussels, not for opportunity, but because her father's work visa had expired and staying meant risk. Overnight, everything changed. School was in French, but the kids in her neighborhood spoke Flemish. Teachers corrected her accent. Classmates mocked the way she rolled her R's. She felt invisible, not because she was quiet, but because no one spoke the same emotional language she did. So I started listening, she said. Not just to words, but to how people use them. The shopkeeper who softened his tone when speaking to elders. The bus driver who switched dialects depending on who boarded. I realized language wasn't just about being understood. It was about making others feel safe. By 14, she was volunteering at a community center that helped newly arrived families, Congolese, Afghan, Syrian. Many didn't speak French or Dutch. They were lost in systems designed for people who sounded normal. Amina became their bridge. She'd sit with a mother filling out asylum forms, translating not just the questions, but the fear behind them. She'd help an elderly man call his son in Canada, holding the phone so he could hear a familiar voice in Tigrinya. I didn't learn languages from apps or classrooms, she said, her voice low. I learned them from people who had nothing left but their mother tongue. And that's sacred? Julian stared into his cup. He'd built his fortune on efficiency, on scaling, on replacing human effort with algorithms. But here was someone who'd spent years doing the opposite. Slowing down, leaning in, giving her time to people the world had forgotten. What about Mandarin? He asked. Or Finnish? Those don't seem connected, she laughed softly. Life isn't a straight line. After high school, I got a scholarship to study linguistics in Helsinki. I didn't know a word of Finnish. My roommate Lisa refused to speak English unless it was absolutely necessary. If you want to live here, she said, you'll learn to feel the language, not just speak it. So I did. I learned through cooking, through silence, through winter walks where words were scarce but presence was everything. As for Mandarin, she'd taken a summer internship with a small NGO in Yunnan province, documenting endangered dialects among ethnic minority groups. There she lived with a Yi family who taught her not just vocabulary, but how tone could carry grief, how a single syllable could hold generations of stories. They didn't care that I was foreign, she said. They cared that I listened. Julian shifted in his seat. And the others? Russian, Arabic, Portuguese. Each one came from a need, she said simply. When the war in Ukraine started, I went to Warsaw. Not as a journalist, not as a hero, just as someone who could sit with people who'd lost everything and say, I see you, in a language that didn't feel like a stranger's tongue. Russian wasn't my choice, it was theirs. And if speaking it helped a grandmother find her granddaughter in a refugee camp, then it was worth every hour of study. She paused, looking at him directly. You asked how I ended up like this. The truth is I didn't choose it. The world kept placing people in front of me who needed to be heard, and I couldn't walk away. Julian swallowed. He thought about his own childhood. Private schools, summer homes, a father who measured success in stock options. He'd never had to translate for his mother at a doctor's office. He'd never watched someone cry because they couldn't explain their pain in the language of the country they'd fled to. I never thought about language like that, he admitted. To me, it was just a tool, like software, something to optimize. Amina nodded. That's the difference. You see language as a product. I see it as a promise that when you speak someone's language, even imperfectly, you're saying, your story matters enough for me to try. And in a world that's always rushing, that try can be everything. Outside, a street musician began playing a fado song, haunting, full of longing. The cafe owner turned the volume down slightly, as if giving space to their conversation. Julian looked at Amina. Really looked at her, not as a curiosity, not as a challenge, but as a person shaped by compassion, not convenience. "Do you ever get tired?" he asked.
Carrying all those voices inside you?
She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Sometimes. But then I meet someone who hasn't been spoken to in their own language in years, and they light up like they've been given back a piece of themselves. And I remember why I do it," he nodded slowly. For the first time, he didn't see her as someone to impress or outsmart. He saw her as a mirror, showing him a version of humanity he'd forgotten existed. And in that quiet cafe, surrounded by the echoes of 1,000 unspoken stories, something in him began to shift. Not dramatically, but deeply. Like a stone settling into place after years of rolling. Weeks passed, and Lisbon settled into its usual rhythm. Golden light on old stone, the scent of salt and pastries drifting through alleyways, tourists getting lost in neighborhoods that had seen centuries come and go. But for Julian, everything felt different. He still went to meetings, still checked his portfolio, still answered emails with the same sharp efficiency. But something had changed inside him. Quietly, steadily, like a compass needle slowly turning toward true north. He couldn't stop thinking about what Amina had said. Language isn't a product. It's a promise. The words echoed in his mind during board calls, during late-night strategy sessions, even while scrolling through headlines about border crises and displaced families. For the first time, he wasn't just seeing statistics, he was hearing voices, real ones, with accents, with pauses, with pain wrapped in syllables no algorithm could decode. One afternoon, he found himself walking through Martim Moniz Square, where immigrants from Angola, Bangladesh, Brazil, and beyond gathered to share news, sell homemade food, and speak in tongues rarely heard in corporate boardrooms. He sat on a bench watching a woman teach her toddler a lullaby in Cape Verdean Creole. He remembered how Amina had spoken to the servers that night, not to show off, but to remind them they belonged. That evening, he texted her. Not a pitch, not a proposal. Just 2 words. "Can we talk?" They met again at the same cafe. This time, Julian didn't come in a tailored suit. He wore a simple sweater, his hair slightly messy like he'd been up late thinking. Amina arrived with a notebook tucked under her arm, pages filled with handwritten phrases in 6 scripts. "I've been doing some reading," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant, "about refugee resettlement, about language barriers in healthcare, legal aid, education. I never realized how much gets lost, not just in translation, but in assumption." She nodded. "Most systems are built for people who sound normal. Everyone else gets filtered out." "Exactly," he said, leaning forward. "And I keep thinking, what if technology could help? Not replace humans, but support them, like a tool that actually listens instead of just transcribing?" Amina raised an eyebrow. She'd heard this before, tech people swooping in with solutions that missed the soul of the problem. "What do you mean?" "I don't mean another voice assistant that stumbles over Wolof or misgenders someone in Arabic," he said quickly, as if reading her mind. "I mean something built with communities, not for them. Something that respects dialects, context, emotion, not just words." She studied him. "You're serious." "I want to be," he admitted. "But I don't know how. I've spent my life building things that scale fast. This needs to grow slow, and I don't know how to do that." For the first time, Amina saw something in him she hadn't expected. Humility. Not the performative kind, but the raw, uncomfortable kind that comes from realizing you've been wrong. "Then start by listening," she said. "Not to me. To the people who live this every day." So he did. The next week, instead of flying to Silicon Valley for a conference, Julian accompanied Amina to a community center in Lisbon's outskirts. It was housed in a converted warehouse, walls painted with murals of doves and olive branches, children's drawings taped to every surface. Here, newcomers practiced Portuguese, filled out paperwork, shared meals, and most importantly, spoke their mother tongues without shame. Julian didn't bring a pitch deck. He brought coffee. And silence. He sat in the back as Amina facilitated a conversation between a Syrian grandmother and a Guinean teenager, both fluent in Arabic, but from wildly different worlds. He watched as a Congolese man struggled to explain his son's asthma symptoms to a nurse who only spoke European Portuguese. He saw the frustration, the fear, the quiet resignation when words failed. Afterward, over lentil soup in the center's kitchen, Amina asked him, "What did you hear?" He thought for a long time. "I heard loneliness." Even in a room full of people, she nodded. Technology can't fix loneliness, but it can help people feel seen. That's the difference. Over the following month, Julian returned again and again. He didn't take notes at first. He just listened. He learned that a Somali mother needed legal help, but couldn't trust a translator she'd never met. He heard a Ukrainian teen say she missed her school not because of the lessons, but because her teacher used to say her name with warmth. He watched Amina sit with an elderly Eritrean man for an hour, just repeating his daughter's name in Tigrinya until he smiled. Slowly, an idea began to form, not in a boardroom but in the cracks between languages, in the spaces where understanding failed. One rainy afternoon, Julian turned to Amina. "What if we built a platform where native speakers, real people, not bots, could offer live, verified translation for critical moments? Healthcare, legal aid, school meetings, and what if the AI part wasn't about replacing them, but training with them, so the system learns dialects, slang, cultural nuance from the source?" Amina didn't answer right away. She stirred her tea, thinking, only if the speakers are paid fairly, only if they control their data, only if the tech serves them, not the other way around. "Of course," he said. "This isn't my project. It's ours, or better yet, it belongs to the communities." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time she saw not a millionaire trying to do good, but a human being trying to be good. "All right," she said, "but we start small. One neighborhood, one language pair. We test it with real people, not investors." He smiled, genuine, unguarded. "Deal." And so, in a modest office above a bakery that smelled of cinnamon and yeast, they began. No press release, no launch party. Just two people, a whiteboard, and a shared belief that the most powerful technology isn't the one that speaks the loudest, but the one that helps others be heard. A year later, the launch event wasn't held in a glass tower or a luxury hotel. It took place in the same community center where it all began. A sunlit room with mismatched chairs, children's drawings still taped to the walls, and the smell of cumin and fried plantains drifting in from the kitchen. There were no red carpets, no press photographers, no investors in designer suits. Just people, mothers, elders, teenagers, volunteers, who had lived the problem and now held the solution in their hands. At the front of the room stood Amina, calm as ever, wearing a simple cotton dress the color of earth after rain. She didn't step onto a stage because there wasn't one. She just stood among them like she always had. When she began to speak, she didn't use a microphone. She didn't need to. Everyone leaned in. She started in Portuguese, welcoming the local families who'd helped shape the project from day one. Then she switched to Wolof, thanking the Senegalese women who'd tested early voice samples and corrected every mispronounced vowel. In Arabic, she honored the elders who'd shared proverbs to teach the system not just words but wisdom. In Ukrainian, she spoke to the teens who'd recorded phrases about school, friendship, and homesickness, so the app wouldn't just translate "I'm sad, but I miss the way my grandmother used to hum while cooking borscht." And then, without warning, she shifted into Finnish. Just a few sentences, soft and melodic, dedicated to Lisa, her old roommate, who'd taught her that silence could be part of language too. A few people in the back clapped, not because they understood the words, but because they felt the care behind them. Julian stood near the door, arms crossed, watching. He wasn't center stage. He hadn't given a speech. He hadn't even been introduced by name. And for the first time in his life, that felt right. He wasn't the hero of this story. He was just someone who'd finally learned to listen. The platform they'd built wasn't flashy. It didn't have flashy animations or celebrity endorsements, but it worked. A nurse in Lisbon could now speak with a patient from Guinea-Bissau through a live interpreter who grew up in the same village. A teacher in Helsinki could understand a Somali student's question about homework, not through a robotic voice, but through a verified community member who knew the cultural context behind the words. In Warsaw, a Ukrainian grandmother could video call her granddaughter in Canada, and the app would gently suggest phrases in her dialect, not the standardized version that felt cold and distant. But the real magic wasn't in the technology. It was in what it unlocked. Dignity, trust, belonging. After Amina finished speaking, a hush settled over the room. Then from the corner, a small voice piped up in Bambara, a language spoken in parts of Mali and Guinea. A girl no older than 8 tugged at Amina's sleeve. Her family had arrived in Portugal just 3 months earlier, fleeing drought and unrest. She'd been quiet all day, watching everything with wide, cautious eyes. "I want to speak like you," she whispered. Amina knelt, bringing herself to the girl's level. She didn't offer praise or promises. She just smiled and said softly in perfect Bambara, "You already do. You just need to believe it." The girl's eyes widened. Then slowly she smiled back, the kind of smile that comes when you realize you're not alone. Later, as people mingled over shared plates of food, Julian found himself near the window, watching the sunset paint the rooftops gold. Amina joined him holding 2 cups of hibiscus tea. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," she corrected. "But really, they did." She nodded toward the room full of people laughing, talking, speaking in languages that once made them feel invisible. "We just gave them a mirror." He took a slow breath. "I used to think success was about building something the whole world would notice. Now I think it's about building something that lets one person feel seen." She looked at him, and for the first time, there was no distance between them. No millionaire, no linguist. Just 2 humans who'd walked different paths to the same truth. "You're changing," she said. "Because you showed me how," he replied. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the hum of voices, Wolof, Romanian, Arabic, Portuguese, Ukrainian, all weaving together like threads in a single tapestry. No one language dominated. None were erased. Each had its place, its rhythm, its right to be heard. Later that night, as Julian walked back through the quiet streets of Lisbon, he passed a group of teenagers sitting on steps, switching between Portuguese and Cape Verdean Creole as they laughed about something only they understood. He didn't stop. He didn't need to, but he smiled. Back in his apartment, he opened his laptop, not to check stock prices or reply to urgent emails, but to listen to a recording Amina had sent him. An elder from Sudan reciting a poem in his native tongue, about rivers that remember every drop that's ever passed through them. Julian didn't understand the words, but he felt their weight. And for the first time, that was enough. Meanwhile, across the city, Amina sat on her balcony, stitching a new dress from fabric sent by her mother. The night air was warm, filled with the distant sound of music and the occasional call of a neighbor in a language she knew by heart. She thought about the little girl who'd tugged her sleeve, about the elders who'd finally been heard, about the quiet revolution happening not in boardrooms, but in kitchens, clinics, and classrooms. She didn't need headlines. She didn't need fame. She just needed to keep showing up, for the voices the world overlooked, for the words that carried more than meaning, for the simple, powerful act of saying, "I hear you." And somewhere in the back of the room that night, Julian finally understood. Real wealth isn't counted in dollars or downloads. It's measured in moments when someone speaks their truth and someone else leans in, not to fix it, but to honor it. That's where change begins. Not with a bang, but with a voice finally being heard.